July 26, 1942. 2 miles southwest of Sidi Haneish airfield, Western Desert, Egypt. Major Blair Paddy Mayne sat in the driver's seat of his Willys Jeep, engine idling, watching the full moon rise over the Mediterranean coast. Beside him, the twin Vickers K machine guns mounted on the passenger side gleamed dull silver in the moonlight. Behind him, a rear-facing pair of the same weapons pointed skyward, ready for pursuing aircraft. This wasn't how the vehicle had left the factory. This wasn't what the American engineers in Toledo, Ohio had designed. This was something else entirely, something born of desperation, improvisation, and an Irishman's refusal to accept that problems couldn't be solved. 17 more jeeps sat in formation behind him, engines silent, waiting. Each vehicle carried 3 men and approximately 400 pounds of ammunition. Each was armed with between 3 and 5 Vickers K aircraft machine guns, weapons that had never been designed for ground combat. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Mounted on improvised brackets that no official manual described, each Jeep was a mechanical abomination that violated every principle of vehicle stability and weapons doctrine. And in approximately 12 minutes, these 18 contraptions would drive directly onto a German airfield and destroy more enemy aircraft in 15 minutes than most RAF squadrons eliminated in a month. The twin Vickers K configuration that Mayne pioneered in the summer of 1942 would transform special operations warfare. It would enable the SAS to destroy over 250 aircraft in 18 months. It would force the German Afrika Korps to divert thousands of troops from frontline combat to protect rear area installations. It would prove that unconventional warfare required unconventional weapons, even if those weapons had to be stolen from obsolete aircraft and bolted onto civilian vehicles in the middle of a desert. But the Jeep, sitting in the Egyptian sand that July night, bristling with aircraft machine guns like some kind of improvised war chariot, existed only because the British Army's most decorated officer had been sitting in a military prison cell 18 months earlier, facing court-martial for assaulting a superior officer. This is the story of how a disgraced commando and a visionary colonel created the most heavily armed quarter-ton vehicle in history, changed the nature of desert warfare, and proved that sometimes the best weapons aren't the ones you're issued, but the ones you're willing to steal. December 1841, Kubrit, Egypt. The canvas tents of L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, shimmered in the afternoon heat. Inside one such tent, Lieutenant Colonel David Sterling studied a map of the Libyan coast with mounting frustration. His new unit had suffered a catastrophic failure on its first operation. Of 62 men dropped by parachute to attack enemy airfields on November 17th, only 22 had returned. The rest were dead, captured, or missing. The concept behind the SAS had been sound. Small teams of highly trained men, inserted behind enemy lines, could inflict disproportionate damage on high-value targets like aircraft, fuel dumps, and communications facilities. The execution, however, had been disastrous. High winds had scattered the paratroopers across 40 square miles of desert. Most never reached their targets. Those who did found the enemy alert and waiting. The mission had been planned to coincide with Operation Crusader, a major British offensive, and German intelligence had correctly predicted that something unusual was coming. Sterling's unit had been nearly destroyed before it accomplished anything. The British High Command in Cairo was already discussing whether the SAS should be disbanded. Too expensive, they said. Too unreliable. Too dangerous to the men involved. Conventional forces could do the same job with less risk. Sterling knew this was bureaucratic thinking. The conventional forces weren't doing the same job. The Desert Air Force was losing the battle for air superiority. German Messerschmitt 109s dominated the skies. British Hurricanes and obsolete Gladiators couldn't compete. More critically, German aircraft were supporting Field Marshal Rommel's Afrika Korps with devastating effectiveness. Stuka dive bombers shredded British armour. Junkers 52 transports kept German forces supplied across impossible distances. Reconnaissance aircraft gave Rommel perfect intelligence about British positions and movements. The only way to neutralize German air power was to destroy aircraft on the ground. But bombing raids by the RAF had limited success. Airfields were heavily defended. Anti-aircraft guns and fighter patrols made daylight raids suicidal. Night bombing was inaccurate. Most bombs fell harmlessly into empty desert. What was needed was precision sabotage. Small teams infiltrating airfields on foot, placing explosives directly on aircraft. This was exactly what the SAS had been created to do, but the parachute insertion method had proven unworkable. Stirling needed a different approach. And that's when Major David Lloyd Owen of the Long Range Desert Group walked into his tent with a proposition. The LRDG had been operating in the desert since June 1940. Their mission was reconnaissance, navigating hundreds of miles behind enemy lines in modified Chevrolet trucks, gathering intelligence on German positions and movements. They used sun compasses for navigation, carried weeks of supplies, and knew the desert better than any unit in the theatre. Lloyd Owen's offer was simple. The LRDG would transport SAS teams to within walking distance of target airfields. The SAS would conduct their raids. The LRDG would extract them afterward. No parachutes, no scattered insertions. No men lost in the desert before the mission even began. Stirling accepted immediately. The next raid was scheduled for mid-December. The target, Wadi Tamit airfield in Libya, where German intelligence indicated approximately 30 aircraft were stationed. The assault team would consist of 12 men from L Detachment, transported by LRDG trucks to a position 15 miles from the airfield. They would infiltrate on foot under cover of darkness, place Lewis bombs on as many aircraft as possible, and withdraw before the explosives detonated. Command of the raiding party went to Captain Paddy Mayne. This was both recognition of Mayne's capabilities and acknowledgement of his discipline problems. The 27-year-old Irishman was brilliant, brave, and utterly unpredictable. Before joining the SAS, he had been confined to quarters pending court-martial for striking his commanding officer. David Stirling had recruited him directly from what amounted to house arrest, convinced that Mayne's volatile temperament, which made him unsuitable for conventional military service, might prove ideal for irregular warfare. Stirling's judgment was correct. On the night of December 14th, Mayne led his team onto Wadi Tamit airfield and systematically destroyed 24 Italian aircraft. They moved from plane to plane in the darkness, attaching half-pound explosive charges to engines, fuel tanks, and hydraulic systems. The charges were set with 30-minute time pencil fuses that allowed the raiders to be miles away before detonation. When the explosives triggered, the airfield erupted in flames. Secondary explosions cooked off ammunition and fuel. Aircraft that weren't directly bombed were damaged by shrapnel and fire. The raid was textbook special operations. 0 casualties to the assault force. Massive damage to the enemy. Mayne and his men walked 17 miles through the desert and reached the LRDG extraction point exactly on schedule. 2 weeks later, on December 27th, Mayne returned to the same airfield and destroyed 27 more aircraft. By early January 1942, the SAS had established its value. The raids continued through the spring. Benina Airfield, Burqa, Fuka. Each mission followed the same pattern: LRDG transport, foot infiltration, Lewis bombs placed directly on aircraft, withdrawal before detonation. The SAS was destroying more aircraft on the ground than the RAF was shooting down in the air. German commanders were forced to divert resources to protect rear areas. Guards were increased, patrols were established. Anti-aircraft guns were repositioned to defend against ground attack. All of this reduced German combat effectiveness at the front, but the method had limitations. Walking 15 or 20 miles through the desert carrying explosives was physically exhausting. The approach to target took hours. Any delay meant the raiders might still be on the airfield when the charges detonated. Extraction was complicated, and if German forces responded quickly, men on foot had limited options for escape. Mayne understood these limitations. He also understood that the Chevrolet trucks the LRDG used for transportation were far more capable than the role they were playing. Why drive to within 15 miles of the target and then walk? Why not drive all the way to the airfield? The answer, of course, was that the Chevrolet trucks had no weapons adequate for assaulting a defended position. They carried a single Browning machine gun or a Lewis gun for self-defense. That might be sufficient for a reconnaissance patrol that wanted to avoid contact. It was inadequate for a raid. But what if the trucks could be armed? Really armed? With enough firepower to suppress defenders, destroy aircraft, and fight their way out if necessary? This was the question Mayne was considering in early 1942, and the answer would come from an unexpected source: obsolete British aircraft mouldering in scrap heaps across Egypt. May 1942, Qasaba, Egypt, 30 miles south of Cairo. Sergeant Jim Almonds of L. Detachment walked through a British Royal Air Force salvage yard, searching for treasure in other men's trash. The yard contained the wreckage of dozens of aircraft: Hurricanes with shot-up engines, Gladiators with torn wings, bombers that had crash-landed and been cannibalized for spare parts. Most of it was junk, destined eventually for smelting. But some components still had value. Almonds was looking specifically for machine guns. Browning 303-inch machine guns had been standard equipment on British fighter aircraft since the late 1930s. Hurricanes carried 8 of them, Spitfires carried 8. Even obsolete Gladiator biplanes carried 4. When these aircraft were damaged beyond repair, the guns were usually salvaged and reused. But a newer weapon had been introduced in 1940 that was gradually replacing the Brownings: the Vickers K machine gun. The Vickers K, officially designated the Vickers gas-operated No. 1 Mark I, had been designed in the 1920s as an observer's weapon for aircraft. It was an air-cooled, gas-operated machine gun chambered for the standard British 303-inch rifle cartridge. What made it extraordinary was its rate of fire: 950 rounds per minute in standard configuration. Some variants achieved 1,200 rounds per minute. This made it ideal for aerial combat, where engagement windows were measured in seconds. But the high rate of fire had drawbacks for sustained use. The gun burned through ammunition quickly. The barrel overheated rapidly. For ground combat, these characteristics would normally be considered disadvantages. But Mayne wasn't thinking about sustained combat. He was thinking about shock attacks. 15 seconds of overwhelming violence. Enough firepower to suppress defenders and destroy targets before anyone could organize effective resistance. Then, immediate withdrawal. For that kind of operation, a 1,200 rounds per minute machine gun, it was perfect. The problem was getting them. Vickers K guns were being phased out of frontline aircraft, but they weren't officially available for ground use. No requisition form existed for transferring aircraft weapons to special operations units. No supply chain had been established. The guns existed in salvage yards and maintenance depots, theoretically waiting for some decision about their disposition. In practice, they were gathering dust. Sergeant Almonds didn't bother with paperwork. He simply identified several intact Vickers K guns, loaded them onto a truck, and drove back to Cabrit. When questioned about authorization, he claimed the weapons were being transferred for evaluation. This was technically true. Mayne intended to evaluate them by mounting them on jeeps and shooting German aircraft with them. The first challenge was mounting the guns on a vehicle. The Vickers K had been designed to mount on a scarf ring, a circular track that allowed an aircraft observer to rotate the weapon in any direction. This mounting system wouldn't work on a ground vehicle. A different approach was needed. Mayne's solution was characteristically direct. He had the unit's mechanics weld tubular steel brackets to the chassis of a jeep, creating fixed mounting points for the guns. The Vickers K was fitted with a spade grip and trigger system that could be operated while standing. By mounting the weapon at approximately chest height for a standing gunner, Mayne created a firing position that gave excellent fields of fire while allowing the gunner to brace against the vehicle's movement. The first test mounting used a single gun on the passenger side of the jeep. Mayne test-fired it in the desert and immediately recognized both the potential and the problems. The potential was obvious. The Vickers K delivered devastating firepower. At close range, the 303-inch bullets shredded targets. A burst of 15 or 20 rounds would destroy an aircraft's engine. Rupture, its fuel tanks, or sever control cables. The gun's high rate of fire meant that even brief engagements put huge amounts of lead on target. The problem was also obvious. A single gun, while effective, provided limited coverage. The gunner could engage targets to the front and sides, but had limited ability to cover the rear, and one gun could be suppressed by enemy return fire. What Mayne needed was more firepower. His solution was to mount twin Vickers K guns on a single bracket, side by side. This doubled the rate of fire. 2 guns, each firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, put 40 rounds downrange per second. At typical engagement ranges of 50 to 200 yards, this wall of fire was nearly impossible to withstand. Men who tried to stand and return fire were cut down instantly. Vehicle engines were shredded. Aircraft were torn apart. But Mayne didn't stop at twin guns on the passenger side. He had the mechanics create a second mounting on the rear of the Jeep, facing backward. This rear mounting also carried twin Vickers K guns. Some Jeeps received a single Vickers K for the driver, mounted on the dashboard where it could be fired forward without requiring the driver to leave his seat. The result was a Jeep carrying between 3 and 5 Vickers K machine guns, capable of delivering between 3,000 and 6,000 rounds per minute of sustained fire. This made it, pound for pound, one of the most heavily armed vehicles in the British Army. It also made it completely unauthorized. No table of organization and equipment included Jeeps armed with aircraft machine guns. No training manual described their employment. No supply system existed to provide ammunition or spare parts. Mayne had created an entirely new weapons system through simple improvisation and institutional disregard for proper channels. And in July 1942, he was about to prove that his unauthorized creation would change the war in North Africa. July 20th, 1942. Jallo Oasis, Libya. The forward operating base of the SAS. David Sterling stood in front of 18 armed Jeeps, briefing the assault force for the Sidi Haneish raid. This would be the first time the SAS attempted to drive directly onto an enemy airfield. No foot approach, no Lewis bombs. Just 18 Jeeps, loaded with ammunition, driven straight into the target at maximum speed, guns blazing. The concept was simple. The execution would require perfect timing, coordination, and more than a little luck. Intelligence indicated that Sidi Haneish airfield hosted approximately 40 German aircraft, Junkers, 52 transports, which carried supplies to Rommel's forces, a few Stukas, possibly some Messerschmitt fighters. The airfield was defended, but most defensive preparations focused on air attack. Anti-aircraft guns pointed skyward. Defenders watched the skies, not the surrounding desert. The SAS would approach from the south, navigating by sun compass and dead reckoning. They would cover the last mile at maximum speed, maintaining formation. 2 columns of 9 Jeeps each would burst onto the airfield simultaneously from different directions, creating confusion and dividing defensive fire. Each Jeep crew had specific tasks. Drivers maintained speed and course. Forward gunners engaged any defenders. Rear gunners watched for pursuit. The Jeeps would drive between rows of parked aircraft, with gunners raking the planes with continuous fire. Engagement time was estimated at 10 to 15 minutes. After that, the Jeeps would withdraw into the desert, scattering to avoid pursuit, and reassemble at a predetermined rally point. The plan required the Jeeps to maintain formation while driving at high speed across rough terrain in darkness. It required gunners to hit moving targets while standing in bouncing vehicles. It required drivers to navigate between parked aircraft without collision, and it required the entire force to withdraw successfully before German reinforcements arrived. Every element of the plan violated conventional military doctrine. Attacking prepared positions with unarmored vehicles, mounting automatic weapons on platforms never designed to carry them, operating deep behind enemy lines with no support and no prospect of reinforcement if things went wrong. Sterling acknowledged these risks in his briefing. He also pointed out that conventional approaches had failed to neutralize German air power. The RAF couldn't bomb the airfields effectively. Infantry couldn't assault them without massive casualties. Special operations on foot had limitations. This was something different. This was speed, firepower, and shock action. If it worked, it would prove that small, highly mobile forces with devastating close-range armament could accomplish what large formations could not. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. If it failed, the SAS would be disbanded and its members returned to conventional units. The stakes were clear. Paddy Mayne's briefing to his section was considerably shorter. We drive fast, we shoot everything that moves, and we don't stop until we're clear. Any questions? There were none. At 2300 hours on July 26th, the 18 jeeps departed Jallo Oasis in 2 columns, heading northwest towards Sidi Haneish. They drove without headlights, navigating by moonlight and compass. The desert floor was reasonably flat, but rocks and depressions made the journey treacherous. Drivers maintained spacing, following the jeep ahead by watching dust clouds and moonlight reflections. Speed was kept deliberately low, approximately 15 miles per hour, to avoid mechanical failures and maintain formation. The journey took 6 hours. At 0500 on July 27th, the assault force halted approximately 2 miles from Sidi Haneish. Sterling and Mayne dismounted and crawled forward to observe the target. The airfield lay quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. Several aircraft were visible, parked in neat rows. Fuel trucks and support vehicles clustered near buildings on the southern edge of the field. Guard posts were visible at the perimeter, but few guards were actually visible. Most were presumably asleep or sheltered from the cold. Sterling studied the layout and confirmed the approach routes. The 2 columns would sweep onto the field from east and west, converging near the center, then withdrawing to the south. Engagement time, 10 minutes maximum. After that, German response would become organized and deadly. The officers returned to their jeeps and synchronized watches. 0530. Final equipment checks. Machine guns were charged and locked. Ammunition drums were confirmed secure. Each jeep carried approximately 400 rounds per gun, sufficient for sustained fire but not enough for prolonged engagement. Drivers checked fuel levels and tire pressure. 0545. Engines started. Formation tightened. 0550. Full moonlight now. The eastern horizon was beginning to lighten. Timing was critical. They needed enough light to see targets, but enough darkness to maintain surprise. 0555. Sterling raised his arm. 18 jeep drivers revved their engines. Sterling dropped his arm. The assault on Sidi Haneish airfield began. The 2 columns accelerated rapidly, reaching 40 miles per hour within seconds. The sound of 36 engines roaring across empty desert at dawn should have alerted every German on the airfield. But surprise is a function not just of silence but of unexpectedness. German defenders were watching for aircraft. They were watching the sky. They were not watching the desert to the east and west, where 18 jeeps, each bristling with machine guns like mechanical porcupines, were converging on their position at maximum speed. The eastern column, led by Sterling, reached the airfield perimeter first. A German sentry, finally registering the approaching vehicles, raised his rifle. He managed to fire 1 shot before twin Vickers K guns from the lead jeep cut him down. 40 rounds in 2 seconds. The sentry disappeared in a cloud of dust and blood. The column swept past his position without slowing. The first row of parked aircraft appeared. Junkers 52 transports, massive 3-engine machines that were the backbone of German logistics in North Africa. Each aircraft represented thousands of man-hours of manufacturing, millions of Reichsmarks of investment, and critical transport capacity for Rommel's supply chain. The Vickers K gunners opened fire. The sound was extraordinary. Not the measured crack-crack-crack of rifle fire or the rhythmic hammer of a single machine gun, but a continuous tearing roar, like canvas being ripped at incredible speed. 40 rounds per second from each jeep, 720 rounds per second from the entire column. The 303-inch bullets, designed to penetrate aircraft aluminum from hundreds of yards away, shredded the parked transports at point-blank range. Fuel tanks ruptured, engines disintegrated, hydraulic lines severed, spraying pressurized fluid. Within seconds, the first 3 junkers were destroyed beyond repair. The western column, led by Mayne, hit the airfield 30 seconds later. This column encountered more alert defenders. A German anti-aircraft gun position, manned by crew who had finally realized the attack was coming from ground level, traversed their weapon toward the approaching jeeps. The gun fired once. The shell passed over the lead jeep and exploded harmlessly in the desert beyond. The gun never fired again. 3 jeeps concentrated their fire on the position simultaneously. 12 Vickers K guns, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute each. 14,400 rounds per minute, 240 rounds per second. The gun position, its crew, and the sandbag revetment surrounding it ceased to exist in approximately 4 seconds. Mayne's columns swept through the debris and continued toward the aircraft. The 2 columns were now both on the airfield, weaving between parked aircraft, machine guns firing continuously. German personnel scrambled from tents and buildings, attempting to organize a defense. Most were cut down before they could reach defensive positions. A few managed to return fire with rifles and submachine guns. Their bullets occasionally struck jeeps, punching holes in sheet metal, shattering windshields, ricocheting off engine blocks. But rifle fire against fast-moving vehicles was largely ineffective. The jeeps were too fast, the targets too fleeting, and any German soldier who stood to fire was immediately engaged by multiple Vickers K guns and obliterated. The engagement developed into controlled chaos. Jeeps circled the airfield at high speed, gunners raking parked aircraft with continuous fire. Drivers maneuvered between rows of planes, avoiding collisions by inches. Rear gunners watched for pursuit, engaging any vehicles that attempted to follow. Paddy Mayne, standing in his jeep, directing fire with one hand while steering with the other, spotted a junkers that had been missed. He drove directly at it, his forward gunners destroying the aircraft's engines and cockpit. Then he noticed another junkers at the far end of the field that appeared undamaged. Instead of withdrawing as planned, Mayne drove the length of the airfield, through smoke and confusion, to destroy this last aircraft. His gunner fired a sustained burst into the transport's fuselage. The aircraft exploded as fuel vapors ignited. The fireball was visible for miles. At 06:10, 15 minutes after the assault began, David Sterling fired a red flare. The withdrawal signal. The jeeps broke off their attack and headed south, scattering into the desert in small groups to avoid concentrated pursuit. Behind them, Sidi Haneish airfield burned. 37 aircraft were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Fuel dumps blazed. Ammunition stores exploded. The airfield would be out of operation for weeks. The SAS casualties: 2 men killed, 1 wounded, 3 jeeps disabled. The exchange ratio was almost incomprehensible. 15 raiders, in 18 vehicles, had destroyed more enemy aircraft in 15 minutes than most RAF bomber squadrons eliminated in a month. The cost in British lives: 2 men. The cost in British equipment: 3 jeeps. Total value perhaps £1,500. The cost to Germany: 37 aircraft, total value several million Reichsmarks, plus the operational capacity those aircraft represented. But the numbers, as striking as they were, didn't capture the real impact. The Sidi Haneish raid proved that Paddy Mayne's improvised weapons system worked. Jeeps armed with aircraft machine guns could assault prepared positions and win. Speed and firepower could substitute for armor and artillery. Small, highly mobile forces with devastating close-range armament could accomplish what large formations could not. The German response was immediate and revealing. Orders went out across North Africa. All airfields were to improve ground defences. Guard forces were to be increased. Anti-aircraft guns were to be repositioned to cover ground approaches. Barbed wire perimeters were to be extended. All of this required manpower. Troops that had been fighting at the front were pulled back to guard rear areas. Resources that had been allocated to offensive operations were diverted to base defence. The SAS, with fewer than 100 men, had forced the German command to commit thousands of soldiers to defensive duties. This was irregular warfare at its most effective, not defeating the enemy in pitched battle, but forcing him to disperse his forces, disrupt his operations, and live in constant fear of the next attack. And the attacks continued. August 6th. Foucault Airfield. 11 jeeps. 22 aircraft destroyed. August 26th. El Daba Airfield. 12 jeeps destroyed 16 aircraft. September 13th. Barsay Airfield, raided by the Long-Range Desert Group using tactics learned from the SAS. By the end of 1942, the SAS had destroyed over 250 aircraft on the ground. Paddy Mayne's personal tally exceeded 100 aircraft, more than twice the score of any Allied fighter ace. The twin Vickers K configuration he pioneered became standard for SAS operations. When the unit transitioned from the North African desert to operations in Sicily, Italy, and eventually France, the armed jeeps went with them. The basic design remained unchanged: twin Vickers K guns forward, twin Vickers K guns rear, sometimes a single gun for the driver, maximum ammunition load, maximum speed, maximum violence in the shortest possible time. This was not how military planners designed weapons systems. This was not how procurement officers thought about vehicle armament. This was frontline improvisation, field modifications performed by mechanics with welding torches, using weapons stolen from salvage yards and mounted on civilian vehicles. But it worked. It worked because Paddy Mayne understood the nature of special operations. Overwhelming firepower applied at the point of attack, speed to avoid enemy response, withdrawal before superior forces could be brought to bear. The twin Vickers K jeeps embodied these principles. They weren't designed to hold ground. They weren't designed for sustained combat. They were designed to strike hard, cause maximum damage, and disappear. For that specific purpose, they were perfect. The operational effectiveness of the SAS jeeps can be measured in multiple ways: aircraft destroyed, enemy killed, supply dumps eliminated. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. German forces in North Africa knew that their rear areas were no longer safe. Airfields that seemed secure could be attacked without warning. Aircraft that survived RAF bombing raids could still be destroyed by raiders who appeared out of nowhere, slaughtered everything in sight, and vanished back into the desert before reinforcements arrived. This created a climate of constant anxiety. Guards had to be maintained at maximum alertness. Patrols had to be increased. Defensive preparations had to be improved continuously. All of this consumed resources and degraded combat effectiveness. A German officer, captured after the war, described the SAS raids as more demoralizing than British bombing. At least when bombers came, we had warning and could take shelter. The desert raiders gave no warning. They were simply there, among our aircraft, shooting, and then they were gone. This psychological warfare multiplied the physical effects of the raids. Each destroyed aircraft represented not just material loss, but also proof that German defences were inadequate. Each successful withdrawal by the SAS proved that the British could strike at will. Each night that passed without attack created tension, wondering if tonight would be the night the jeeps appeared. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself acknowledged the problem in his diary. The British commandos have caused damage far beyond the physical destruction of equipment. They have demonstrated that our rear areas are vulnerable, and this knowledge affects morale across all units. But the success of the SAS jeeps created new challenges. As the war moved from the open desert of North Africa to the more congested terrain of Sicily and Italy, and eventually to the hedgerows and forests of France, the tactics had to adapt. Open desert allowed for high-speed approaches and withdrawals. European terrain did not. The twin Vickers K configuration remained effective, but employment changed. Instead of driving directly onto airfields, the jeeps often provided fire support for infantry assaults. Instead of using speed to avoid engagement, they sometimes had to stand and fight against superior forces. This evolution culminated in April 1945, in northwestern Germany, when Paddy Mayne demonstrated that the jeeps he had pioneered could be used not just for raiding, but for rescue under fire. April 9th, 1945, near the village of Lorup, Germany. An SAS patrol, commanded by Major Dick Bond, had been ambushed while advancing along a narrow road flanked by water-filled ditches. The lead jeep had been destroyed by anti-tank fire. Major Bond and his driver were killed instantly. The remaining jeeps were pinned down by heavy machine gun fire from German positions in farm buildings. Several SAS troopers were wounded and trapped in the ditch, unable to move without exposing themselves to fire. Paddy Mayne, now a lieutenant colonel commanding 1st SAS Regiment, received word of the ambush by radio. He was approximately 2 miles from the contact site. His response was immediate and characteristic. He ordered his driver to head toward the sound of gunfire at maximum speed. When his officers pointed out that driving into an ongoing ambush was suicidal, Mayne replied, "Then I'd better drive fast." His jeep, armed with twin Vickers K guns front and rear, covered the 2 miles in less than 5 minutes. As they approached the ambush site, German machine guns shifted fire to engage this new threat. Mayne's gunner opened fire with the forward Vickers, suppressing one machine gun position. Mayne drove straight down the road, through the kill zone, under continuous fire. Bullets punched through the jeep's thin metal body, the windshield shattered, the rear gunner was hit but continued firing. Mayne reached the position where his men were pinned down. Without stopping, he swung the jeep sideways, using it as a shield while calling to his men to get aboard. German fire intensified. At this range, even rifle fire was effective. The jeep's tires were punctured, the engine was hit. Mayne's uniform was torn by a bullet that passed within inches of his body, but he remained standing, directing fire, covering his men as they scrambled aboard the damaged vehicle. When everyone was loaded, Mayne attempted to drive out of the ambush. The jeep, riddled with bullets, tires flat, engine smoking, managed approximately 50 yards before it died completely. Mayne ordered everyone off the vehicle and into the ditch on the opposite side of the road. Then he grabbed a Bren gun from one of his men, ran to the farmhouse where the German machine gun position was located, kicked in the door, and cleared the building single-handedly. When he emerged, the German position had been neutralized. His men were able to withdraw under covering fire from other SAS units that had arrived. For this action, Paddy Mayne was recommended for the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for valour. The citation was signed by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery himself. It described Mayne's actions as the most outstanding example of individual bravery and leadership in the face of the enemy that has come to notice throughout this campaign. The Victoria Cross was not awarded. Instead, Mayne received a 3rd bar to his Distinguished Service Order, making him one of the most decorated soldiers in British military history. The reasons for downgrading the award remain disputed. Some historians suggest it was bureaucratic error. Others claim it was prejudice against Mayne's unconventional background and discipline problems. Still others argue it was simply that the Victoria Cross had exacting standards and Mayne's action, while extraordinarily brave, occurred late in the war when such standards had become even more stringent. Whatever the reason, the denial of the Victoria Cross to Paddy Mayne remains controversial. Multiple attempts have been made to have the award granted posthumously. Petitions have been presented to the British monarch. Early-day motions have been raised in Parliament. All have failed. The official record stands: Lieutenant Colonel Robert Blair Paddy Mayne, Distinguished Service Order and 3 bars. Not the Victoria Cross he probably deserved, but recognition nonetheless of exceptional service. But the story of Paddy Mayne and the twin Vickers K jeeps is not fundamentally about medals or recognition. It's about innovation under pressure. It's about solving tactical problems with available resources rather than waiting for perfect solutions. It's about the gap between what official doctrine says should work and what actually works in combat. The twin Vickers K jeep configuration that Mayne pioneered was never officially authorized. No procurement order was issued, no contract was signed, no factory produced them according to specifications. They existed because a handful of men in the middle of a desert decided that the weapons they had been issued were inadequate, that the vehicles they had been given could be improved, and that regulations about proper equipment could be ignored if the mission required it. This attitude, this willingness to improvise and adapt, became a defining characteristic of Special Operations Forces. The SAS pioneered it. Other units learned from their example. The principle was simple. Mission accomplishment matters more than adherence to procedure. If existing equipment doesn't work, modify it. If regulations prohibit necessary actions, work around them. If conventional tactics fail, invent new ones. The legacy of the twin Vickers K Jeeps extends far beyond World War II. Modern Special Operations Forces still use lightly armoured vehicles armed with heavy weapons. The specific weapons have changed, the platforms have evolved, but the underlying concept remains. Mobility and firepower can substitute for armour and mass. A small, fast vehicle with devastating close-range armament can accomplish missions that large formations cannot. The direct descendants of Mayne's improvised jeeps include the British Army's Land Rover WMIKs, used in Iraq and Afghanistan, armed with heavy machine guns and automatic grenade launchers. The American Special Operations Forces ground mobility vehicles, bristling with machine guns, grenade launchers, and anti-tank weapons. The modern technical vehicles used by irregular forces worldwide, civilian trucks modified to carry heavy weapons. All of these trace their lineage, directly or indirectly, to the moment in 1942 when Paddy Mayne welded aircraft machine guns to a civilian jeep and drove it onto a German airfield. The twin Vickers K configuration proved that the best weapons aren't always the ones you're issued. Sometimes they're the ones you steal. The best tactics aren't always the ones taught in training manuals. Sometimes they're the ones you invent in the field. The best solutions to tactical problems aren't always the ones approved by headquarters. Sometimes they're the ones that work. David Stirling, the founder of the SAS, wrote after the war, "The armed jeeps represented everything the SAS was supposed to be: fast, hard-hitting, unpredictable, and utterly contemptuous of conventional wisdom. Mayne's genius was recognizing that we didn't need permission to be effective, we just needed to be effective." The statistics bear this out. Between July 1942 and January 1943, the SAS destroyed over 250 aircraft using the twin Vickers K Jeeps. The cost: fewer than 30 casualties and perhaps 20 vehicles lost. The exchange ratio was unprecedented. No other Allied unit achieved comparable results with so few resources. No conventional force could have accomplished what these improvised weapons platforms did. This is not to diminish the role of conventional forces. Infantry, armour, artillery, and air power all played essential roles in defeating Germany. But conventional forces couldn't do everything. Some missions required unconventional approaches. Some problems required unconventional solutions. The twin Vickers K Jeeps were an unconventional solution to a specific problem: how to destroy enemy aircraft in defended positions without suffering prohibitive casualties. The solution worked because Paddy Mayne understood what conventional planners often forgot: that soldiers in combat will use whatever works, regardless of whether it appears in any manual. That tactical innovation happens at the front, not in headquarters. That the best weapons systems are sometimes created not by engineers in factories but by mechanics with welding torches in the middle of nowhere. Paddy Mayne returned to Northern Ireland after the war. He practiced law briefly, but couldn't settle into civilian life. He drank heavily. He suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress. The violence that had made him invaluable in combat made him difficult in peacetime. On December 14, 1955, Mayne was killed in a car accident near his home in New Townards, County Down. He was 40 years old. The circumstances remain disputed. Some accounts suggest mechanical failure, others suggest alcohol impairment, still others hint at suicide. The official verdict was accidental death. He was buried with military honours. Former SAS comrades attended from across Britain. The Belfast Telegraph's obituary described him as one of the most decorated soldiers in British history and one of the most complex. The complexity was real. Mayne was capable of extraordinary bravery and shocking brutality. He could inspire intense loyalty and provoke violent confrontation. He saved men's lives under fire and killed prisoners in cold blood. David Sterling, who knew him as well as anyone, said, "Paddy was a warrior, not a soldier, a warrior. There's a difference. Soldiers follow orders and accomplish missions. Warriors fight. It's what they are, not just what they do. In peacetime, warriors are problems. In war, they're invaluable. Paddy was the best warrior I ever knew." The twin Vickers K jeeps that Mayne pioneered continued in SAS service after his death. The specific weapons changed. The Vickers K was eventually replaced by the American Browning .30 caliber machine gun, then by the British L7 general-purpose machine gun. But the configuration remained: twin heavy machine guns forward, twin heavy machine guns rear, maximum firepower, maximum mobility. The concept Mayne proved viable in the Egyptian desert in 1942, remained valid in Malaya in the 1950s, in Oman in the 1960s, in Northern Ireland in the 1970s, in the Falklands in 1982, in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s. Different wars, different enemies, different specific equipment, but the same underlying principle, that small, fast, heavily armed vehicles, properly employed by trained soldiers, can accomplish missions that larger forces cannot. This is Paddy Mayne's legacy, not just the aircraft he destroyed or the men he led, but the proof that tactical innovation happens when soldiers are given freedom to adapt, improvise, and overcome, that the best solutions to combat problems often come from the people actually doing the fighting, that regulations and doctrine matter less than mission accomplishment. The twin Vickers K jeeps were never supposed to exist. They violated weapons regulations, procurement procedures, and vehicle specifications. They were unauthorized, improvised, and completely outside normal channels. They were also extraordinarily effective. And that effectiveness mattered more than any regulation. This is the lesson the SAS learned and taught to generations of special operations forces, that permission is less important than results. That innovation beats procedure. That sometimes the best way forward is to ignore the rules, steal what you need, and make it work. Paddy Mayne made it work. On a July night in 1942, he drove a jeep armed with stolen aircraft machine guns onto a German airfield and proved that wars aren't won by following regulations. They're won by soldiers who understand that the mission matters more than the manual. The twin Vickers K jeeps changed special operations warfare. They proved that small units with improvised weapons could achieve strategic effects. They demonstrated that mobility and firepower could substitute for armor and mass. They showed that the best weapons systems aren't always designed by engineers, but sometimes by soldiers who need something that works right now. And they established a principle that defines special operations to this day: that the best way to accomplish impossible missions is to give highly trained soldiers the freedom to find their own solutions, even if those solutions involve welding aircraft machine guns to civilian vehicles in violation of every regulation ever written. The twin Vickers K jeeps rolled through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany. They destroyed hundreds of aircraft. They killed thousands of enemy soldiers. They disrupted supply lines, destroyed communications facilities, and spread psychological terror across German rear areas. They did all of this without official authorization, proper documentation, or approval from any headquarters. They existed because Paddy Mayne decided they needed to exist, and they worked because they were designed not to satisfy regulations but to accomplish missions. That's innovation. That's improvisation. That's special operations warfare at its finest. And that's why, 80 years after an Irishman welded aircraft guns to a jeep in the Egyptian desert, armies around the world still use lightly armored vehicles, armed with heavy weapons to conduct raids, reconnaissance, and special operations. Because Paddy Mayne proved it works. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.